They were the quintessential hard rock band, igniting a collision of wild hedonism and heavy metal thunder. And now, more than 35 years since their formation, the legacy of Led Zeppelin still resounds loudly.
In those days, in the 60s, there were sort of two geographical areas that were creating new music. And one was the north, Liverpool, where you had the Beatles. And then down south, there were bands like the Rolling Stones, Alexis Corner, and the Embryo Yardbirds. But it appears to me that the bands in the south, like ourselves and the Rolling Stones, were influenced by American black blues artists.
I hear the blues all in the air.
And that's what tended to turn on the bands in the South, like the Yardbirds. In our very early stages as a band, we tried to emulate that sound, probably badly.
We started getting inputs of Josh White, Leadbelly particularly, on, you know, people like that on the countryside. And people like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf on the urban side.
And my mojo working, buddy, just don't worry on you.
But those records were kind of underground, but they said something to you. They had a direct message, which was a very different message from the message that you were getting from your normal pop lyric.
My doctor put me on milk, cream, alcohol.
It was pretty austere in England for quite a long time. You know, we just come out of a European war. Americans may not realize, but up until, you know, even quite the late 50s, we were still rationed. You couldn't get things. Luxury items were, you know, pretty minimal. Also, the music at the time, prior to that explosion in the 60s, was pretty narrow, it was pretty kitsch. The British government started the great art school experiment. And what happened is people like myself and Clapton and Pete Townsend and a lot of people found ourselves in this wonderfully liberated, ridiculously liberated environment. We then heard some black American music.
I worked in a record store. There was another guy across town in this little town called Woking in Surrey. It was a competition between us who could get the records from America the quickest, you know. All the blues records, all the R&B records, some rock records that were coming out of America, you know. And it was a competition. It really is true that that whole era was English musicians getting seriously influenced by what was coming out in the States.
What are your two names?
James Page and
David House. Both from Epsom. And you're just learning to play the guitar?
Yes,
from a teacher. Do you play anything except skiffle?
Yes, Spanish and dance.
Do you as well?
I mean, you really had to stick by the radio and listen to overseas radio and things like that to even hear good rock records. The record that made me want to play guitar was Baby Let's Play House, Presley.
Come back, baby, I want to play house with you. Hit it!
I heard that record. I just wanted to be part of it. I knew something was going on. I heard an acoustic guitar and a slap bass and an electric guitar, the string instruments, and my voice. And it seemed to generate so much energy.
We were all teenagers together, more or less. Page, Plant, Lennon, McCartney, you name it. By the time we'd reached the age of 20, we were playing that and having our own versions of it, which was then a completely new thing among the kids, which automatically, being based in the same language, took America by storm. So we were exporting what was already American, re-exporting it to America.
And I realized that they were starting some kind of new genre of music from the English side. Keith Richards was doing that in Satisfaction. He had the fuzz tone and all that. The lead guitar work of these guys, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, and Eric Clapton, was just something out of this world. And obviously the influences were American blues.
I was concentrating more on blues playing. I used to go out and just jam on a Thursday night. And somebody came up to me and said, would you like to play on a record? I said, yeah. why not? From that point, I suddenly started getting all this studio work coming in.
We knew Jimmy Page, but he at the time was very ensconced doing London session work.
Well, Jimmy was like John Paul Jones. He came from that old school, even though he was very, very young at the time, where he was a session guy. He played on Little Help from My Friends, Joe Cocker. He was a guitarist on that. I mean, he was a seasoned session musician in his early 20s.
There was only one other session guitarist who was working as steadily as Jimmy Page, Big Jim Sullivan.
I was a better country player than Jimmy. I could play all the bendy country stuff better than Jimmy could, and he could play the rock stuff and the blues. So we hit a real happy medium in the studio, because whenever there was a country session, I would do it, and whenever there was a rock session, he would do it.
If you're on your way up and session work is a part of your, your experience, you get to see producers, you get to see the bullshit that goes on, you get to see arrangers, how they arrange a piece, and you get the sense of dynamics in music. I was a huge fan of John Paul Jones as well, because he played bass on a lot of sessions that I did in London.
The rhythm section during the mid-60s onwards, Bobby Graham on drums, John Paul Jones on bass, Jimmy and myself. We come to the end of this roaring rock number, one or the other of us had done a fantastic solo, it had been really tight and super, and you get this voice from the box going, yeah, lads, that was kind of all right, yeah, can we try another one? Take 39, and that's how it's been for 39 takes, You've given your heart, you've done, and all you get from the box, yeah, that was okay. What kind of inspiration are these people portraying to you,
It was fun in the beginning of it, when it was like, oh, do what you want, but then 80%, 90% of the time I didn't know what session I was going in on, and one day I did a Music session, and it was horrific. It was just reading music all the way through. They don't stop. It's just like you hear it in these horrific lift things, You just keep turning the music and playing on it. That's it, I'm finished, I'm out. And that was at the time when I was hanging around with Jeff, going to Yardbirds gigs, and the bass player decided to leave the band, and I joined on bass just to help me out on a couple of gigs, and then it was on to guitar.
Direct from England to Hullabaloo, the wild beat of the Yardbirds.
The Yardbirds were heralded as one of England's most authentic and pioneering blues bands in the 60s. Feeling creatively stifled as a session player, Jimmy Page decided to take advantage of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Paul Samuel Smith decided to come off the road and concentrate on producing. Jimmy, amazingly enough, joined us on bass for a while.
Anyone that can play as well as Jimmy can play bass pretty well, He was so keen to get in the band. He really wanted to join. It was like a little boy, Yeah, I'll play bass, I'll play tambourine if you want, whatever. When we played the Carousel in San Francisco, and it was one of those days when Jeff was ill. They made an announcement on the PA. They said, oh, well, Jeff Beck won't be doing this gig, but the bass player's going to play lead guitar. And everyone said, oh, no, Because the bass player was Jimmy Page, so I think they were quite satisfied.
They were touring here. I think, there was a lot of hope for what was going to happen, and I think Beck kind of flaked, ran off to be with his girlfriend in the middle of a tour, and I think the band lost steam.
I freaked out, went mad, had a breakdown, and I think I walked out and left the band. So the Yardbirds continued without me, and I disappeared, and Jim carried on.
Now taking over the lead guitarist slot, Jimmy Page impressed his fellow bandmates with his six-string virtuosity.
He brought his beautiful skill with chording and riffing and a much harder edge. And he was very disciplined. He'd come from session work. He was a very professional guy, And he was ambitious and he was fresh. So he brought all that energy into the last 18 months of the band. What I would have called the harder-edged, precursor Led Zeppelin mood with Jimmy Page.
Jimmy's tenure with the Yardbirds turned out to be short-lived, but something bigger was waiting right around the corner.
You know, after sort of working for a long period and no money at the end of it and all that sort of thing, there was big management disputes. Just no chance.
As much as Jimmy wanted to keep it going, they finally decided there are other things they could do. And I think there were different musical things going on with everybody.
He knew, and we all knew that this was the Yardbirds' last tour. And he also knew that he was going to get the name. And you knew from the musicianship that he had that anyone who was going to be in the band with him had to be up to that caliber, which was going to be very high. John Paul Jones, of course, knew Jimmy from the old session days, and he said, listen, he said, I heard you're forming a band. He said, I wouldn't mind going on the road, you know, what's it going to be? And that's how they all got together.
I was moping around the house one day, and my missus said to me, will you stop moping around the house? Why don't you join a band or something? She said, Jimmy Page is forming a group because he just left the Yardbirds. She said, why don't you give him a ring, you know?
My brother calls me, he says this, Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones have gotten together. I went, fucking hell. Those two?
John Paul's like an expert. John Paul's the music buffing. So they had the music buffing in the background. Who's a good keyboard player, good bass player, you know, brilliant musician.
The two singers actually had an underground sort of name at that time in '68 was Joe Cocker and Terry Reid.
He asked me to be the singer in this new band he's putting together, which was very impressive. I said, I'd love to do this. Can you hold that thought? If you're not in now, you're out.
Terry Reid couldn't do it. He said, I know this great singer who lives in Wolverhampton or wherever called Robert Plant. So Jimmy and Peter went up to see Robert Plant perform somewhere.
Jimmy was so impressed with Robert Plant's singing that he invited the fledgling vocalist to his boathouse on the Thames, where the two discovered they shared the same love of the blues. Robert was now in, and the pieces were falling into place.
Robert is amazing. He was just, you know, the boy from Birmingham. He had such a powerful, strong presence about him. I don't know, when Robert walked in a room, you just noticed him.
Robert Plant immediately went to work convincing his friend, drummer John Bonham, to join the new band.
Bonzo didn't want to join the band for the longest time. He was earning good money in the local dance band, I suppose. He didn't want to jeopardize that. He didn't want to leave.
Encouraged by the enthusiasm of his old friend, Robert Plant, John Bonham accepted Page's offer and decided to join.
First time we all met in this little room in Gerrard Street, just to see if we could even stand each other, you know. So we said, well, you know, we're all here, you know, what are we going to play? And Jimmy said, well, do you know a number called The Train? Train Kept a Rolling. No. We said, well, it's this easy, it's just go, you know, it's just sort of on an E, but just the G to the G, so he started off. So he said, all right, then, count it in. And suddenly went, and it went, fuck, you know. The room exploded. Oh, and then we just looked at each other and said, right, we're on, you know, this is it. This is going to work.
The chemistry amongst the four of them, their look, their sound, their knowledge of music, Bonham's steady anchor on the drums, Page's riffs. They knew how at the time, how to jam and not lose the jam. They knew when to come back at the proper time, very tightly.
Robert brought a lot of the blues to Led Zeppelin. You know, he was a real blues man, great harp player, you know, great front man, looked the part, but he was a real blueser. Bonzo was just this unreal drummer. So they were a great package.
Started under the name of the New Yardbirds, because nobody else would book us under anything else, you know. You know, oh, who the hell are they? Oh, Jimmy, well, we know Jimmy Page, and we know the Yardbirds. You're going to have to be the New Yardbirds. We rehearsed an act, an album, on a tour in about 3 weeks, and it took off.
He had gigs that were contracted under the name the Yardbirds, so Zeppelin did their, you know, first 6-8 gigs under that New Yardbirds name.
And one day I had a call from Jimmy, and he actually came up to the office kind of unannounced, really. He just wandered in. He'd liked a review I'd done of one of his bands he'd been in years before. So he thought, oh well, I'll speak to this guy, Chris, and tell him about my new group. And I said, well, what's it called? He said, it's Led Zeppelin. And I wrote it in my notepad, and I misspelt it. I wrote L-E-A-D. And he said, no, L-E-D. So I had the scoop on this amazing new band. They chose the name Led Zeppelin through The Who, actually, because there was a story that Keith Moon and John Entwistle had planned to split from The Who. They wanted to form a supergroup. I think Jimmy Page was involved in that, actually.
We're all drunk, as usual. And they were bringing up the thing, we want to leave The Who, we want to start a new band, and then they were bantering around names. But the guy who came up with the name Led Zeppelin was actually John Entwistle, it wasn't Keith Moon. And how it came about is there was an old saying in England that, it'll go down like a Led Zeppelin, which means it'll bomb.
After fulfilling all of the previously booked dates as the new Yardbirds, the band made its official debut as Led Zeppelin at Surrey University in England on October 25th, 1968.
Really, the basis of their sound was the Yardbird sound. And I remember Jimmy playing me their first album, and of course Dazed and Confused was on there. We used to play that, and they did their own version, which wasn't far away. And they did a couple of other things that were pretty similar. It was a springboard. Our sound was a springboard for them, but they took it a bit further. They took it into that early heavy metal, really.
It was just really like a jam. Things like How Many More Time and Dazed and Confused were really just extensions of how well we actually fitted together, The qualities of Led Zeppelin 1 can never be touched, never be matched, never be equal.
The first time I heard Led Zeppelin, I put on the record, and I listened to it. I said, wow, I really didn't know who those guys were. I knew who Jimmy Page was. I didn't know who they were. The sound of the record was really impressive. Still to this day, you put it on, it puts most other stuff to shame.
The first song I heard of theirs was Good Times, Bad Times, and I was immediately struck by this drumming. I'd never heard this drumming before.
Communication breakdown, the first time you hear it, it was like, oh my God. And you tried to play the break, and it was just too damn fast. So you'd wind up scratching your records, trying to slow it down and play it backwards. And, all of my records had these needle marks that went straight across from trying to learn the guitar breaks.
They wanted us to take them on tour with us as an opening act, which is pretty ridiculous when you think about it now. And I was just blown away.
The tour was paid for, underwritten by Jimmy Page, Peter Grant and John Paul Jones. The other two, Bonham and Plant, were on salaries. There was 5 shows with the Vanilla Fudge. It was actually in the one in Oregon where I really realised. And during the drum solo, I was standing there with Jonesy, and I just said to Jesus Christ, where'd you find this guy?
I think that they're coming to listen to what you're playing and not just to look at you and see what you are. I mean, I remember when I was, let's go back a few years, when I first went to see the Beatles, because we mentioned them a few times, it was to look at them, It wasn't, you didn't really bother what you were listening to.
Yeah.
And today, it's not what you are, it's what you're playing.
Well, Bonzo was the best hard rock drummer ever, hands down. I mean, no one comes within a mile of him. He kept great time. He was fearless. He'd do things that you think, how's he going to do this? He was the best.
Being the drummer, first my attention went to John Bonham and his foot thing that he did in Good Times, Bad Times, which was at the time totally unique, had I thought that. Upon meeting him, he said to me that I got that from you. I said, I know, I don't do that. And he pointed out on the Vanilla Fudge album where I actually did it one time. And he took it to the extreme.
The audience just didn't know what to believe, what they were seeing and hearing. It was different than what they'd ever heard before, and it was powerful. It was just non-stop. But the thing was that they were so powerful that anyone who came after them, they might as well have not gone on the stage.
Without a doubt. They were the first band to blow us off the stage. Led Zeppelin.
The band would come in and do what was called underground, those clubs and everything.
They played the Whiskey. It was an amazing show. It was like ridiculous. Can you imagine that band in that small club? It holds like 300 people. It was chaos.
They went wild, hands up, jumping up and down. It's just,
a great show, great music.
They played a place called the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was Boston's version of the Fillmore. So maybe 200 people, maybe 250 tops that first night. And they blew us all away. So I went back on the air the next day and just said, you've got to go see this band.
When they started breaking, I mean, they couldn't believe it. They started out as really just four musicians who, got together. And then when they started breaking, I mean, it was just, amazing.
By the time they'd finished and ended up in New York, they'd taken the whole country by storm. I mean, there wasn't a band that wanted to play before them. I mean, they set the precedent for what they did a few years later was not to play with anyone and just do the 2 to 2.5 to 3 hour set.
Energized by the overwhelming success of their inaugural tour of the States, Led Zeppelin returned to England, but the British media ignored them. It was a bitter pill to swallow. And after a month and a half, the band returned to America. Once again in front of adoring, appreciative crowds, Led Zeppelin felt right at home.
The second tour was the summer of '69, and by then I had gotten John his drum set, which is exactly like mine. It was a 226 bass drums with a big tom in the middle, 2 floors, and a big snare drum with a gong.
A lot of drummers have all these props, but don't use them. They might hit it once a song. He used everything.
We played the same places, roughly, like the Fillmores and the Boston Tea Party. And when they went on the stage the second time, you could see that they were anticipating, the audience was anticipating their arrival and the performance. And then it just went up from there.
While on tour, whatever downtime the group could find was spent working on their second album in recording studios.
Atlantic Records would do it for us. Book a studio, the band would go in, do a bit more, come out with the tapes, go on to another city, play another show, go in late that night or that afternoon. And that's how they made the record.
As Zeppelin's popularity grew, so did their bank accounts. They were offered $250,000 to play the Yale Bowl in New Haven, Connecticut, but the group turned it down so that they could perform instead at the Bath Festival of Blues and Progressive Music back in England.
The first real major acceptance came over here. I think that tends to piss the English critics off. Anything that gets discovered in America, English critics have a problem with.
The prestige of playing at the festival in their homeland gave them something that money couldn't buy: respect and acceptance. Led Zeppelin was fast becoming the #1 rock and roll band in the world.
In our position, we've spent years and years on the road, sort of playing in little church halls and being beaten up and bricks thrown through the van windows and everything. And to have money at last is just another figure in my mind of mass acceptance, which is what we all work for.
When Led Zeppelin II was finally finished, the album was released stateside on October 22nd, 1969, and was an instant hit with timeless classics like Whole Lotta Love and Heartbreaker. It didn't take long for Led Zeppelin II to knock the Beatles' Abbey Road off the top of the charts. At 5 minutes, 33 seconds, the album's centerpiece, Whole Lotta Love, was deemed too long for AM radio airplay. So Atlantic released an edited version as a single. The band wasn't happy.
They didn't like releasing singles, but I think it may have been because they wanted to, originally one of the things was they wanted to show the whole product of the album.
If you take a single off an album and stick it out, that's just a part of the album. It might as well stay on the album, But in the past, through Atlantic Records, they've worried us into saying, let's have a single, There's the top 40 stations over there, and lots of young kids who probably wouldn't get into the album unless they heard a track on the top 40 stations, I personally don't agree with it.
Whole Lotta Love, that was their single, especially in the middle with the bongos and then Bonham's big roll, and then Page with the lead, and then come out of it perfectly. What a song.
The band members were garnering a lot of attention, not only for their music, but also for the way they dressed on stage, especially Jimmy.
Well, he wore velvets, though, and satins and silks and embroidered things and beaded things. And, it was a feminine thing, a lot of chiffon, patent leather shoes, things like that, you know. These guys are androgynous. It feels safe in a way. You know, you feel like you're almost connecting with another part of yourself. That was a very interesting draw for young women, too.
I think Jimmy Page really invented that image of the almighty rock guitar player.
The cloud of mystique that shadowed the band grew with the news of Jimmy Page's interest in Aleister Crowley, an early 20th century Englishman aligned with black magic and demonology. Page's fascination with Crowley led many to believe he was into black magic himself.
I think he was absolutely fascinated with the man and the knowledge of the will. I don't think, I mean, you know, he owned a lot of manuscripts, and he bought the Inverness Castle. That was also Crowley's. And I think with it, he had purchased a lot of manuscripts. And at one point, he had a bookstore in England, an occult bookstore. And he was really more fascinated by the knowledge of it.
It was a sincere fascination, and I think he took a lot out of it. And I think it came through in his music, a lot of that amazing depth and, you know, mystery and all that came out in his music. He was very interested in those types of things, otherworldly things. You know, all that selling the soul to the devil, so that's just bullshit. None of that took place. None of it.
I mean, the whole myth about selling their soul to the devil, we want you to cut your hand in blood, we want you to make a pact you're going to be a wreck. Oh, fuck off, put the fucking devil in your shit, get out of here, you know, I mean, he just wouldn't, what the hell are you talking about? I mean, it just wouldn't happen.
Despite the truckloads of money that were now pouring in, whenever Led Zeppelin was in Los Angeles, they chose to stay at the relatively luxury-free Continental Hyatt House on the Sunset Strip.
We, of course, could have stayed anywhere with the money that we had, but we just preferred that hotel.
They always used to rent the whole top of the Hyatt House. For one thing, the swimming pool was on the top, on the roof, you know, so they could always go up to the swimming pool and do their thing. But as the lift door opened, and I looked out, the carpet had about foam about that deep. As I looked out, this naked girl came sliding past on her belly, and then another one, and then followed by John Paul Jones and John Bonham.
When our own crew was in town, and the Choco crew, we obviously had all what rooms we wanted on the Sunset side. The rear side we gave to the road crew. We went into the road crew's rooms, took their televisions out, threw them out of the windows on the other side, so that when the people came running upstairs, they'd look and see the television still there. They didn't comprehend that we'd taken them off the other side and thrown them out that window.
Every single floor was a party. Everywhere you looked, there were people hanging out. Everybody called it the Riot House, the Hyatt House, because it was a party house.
The manager's there, and Peter and I are standing there, and I've got the cash, and we're going through the bill, and the guy's doing the bill, and he says, this and that, and you know, you had these rooms, and you threw that out the window and that, and we said, no, you know what, we fucking know what we've done, just give us the bill, how much do you want? Fine, got out the money. And the guy looked, and I said, well, we're fucking paid you, what's wrong with you? He said, it's not that. He said, don't you know what, I can't imagine what it must be like for you guys. He said, I work in this fucking hotel. I'd love to smash a room up. So Peter said, oh, is that all it is? Well, go and take one of the rooms and go and smash it up. We're leaving in 15 minutes and bring me the bill.
It was rock and roll. It was all about the decadence. How could you not like having limos and jets and women and, you know, the Beatles hanging out with you every night and Stevie Wonder and this and that, you know, and the champagne and it was fun.
Yeah, I think they sort of pretty much, you know, set the industry standard there, raised the bar. In fact, it only actually increased the interest in them, because you stopped thinking about them just totally in this musical sense, you know. They were just a kind of spectacle, and it was just a bombardment of light and sound, and now there was a completely new dimension to this group, this appalling behaviour and excess, and in a way it kind of provided this incredibly rich soap opera.
The band returned home exhausted from months on the road. Robert and Jimmy took to a secluded spot in Wales called Branrar. The isolation of the beautiful countryside was the perfect place to write and inspired the organic acoustic-based material that comprised much of the next album, Led Zeppelin 3. Later, the band and crew convened at Headley Grange, a house in the English countryside.
It was this old farming sort of mansion. There were 4 floors. So it was like walking into almost the lobby of a hotel.
It was built in the 18th century, and it had about 10 bedrooms. Very spooky, especially early in the morning with the mist, you know, and this black dog that had died the week before. That's where Zeppelin got that track from. There was a dog that died in one of the rooms, and big baronial type banquet hall and huge fireplaces, huge basement which ran the length and breadth of the house.
The main thing is that they're all together, so therefore you don't waste time. You haven't got 4 people and an engineer and well, there wasn't a producer, Jimmy was the producer, but an engineer, coming from different parts to be at a studio to start work at a certain time. They were there, and when they wanted to start, they started.
The appeal of recording like that is that you're never under a red light. The place is yours to come and go as you wish, whatever time if you want to get up at 2 in the morning and record, you can. So you're not constricted by any time parameters. And it's a very leisurely approach to recording.
Things were getting light on the radio. You had Carly Simon, James Taylor. The people were wearing earth tone colors, so they started getting a little lighter too.
When you think about it, a large portion of their songs were folk songs, with just 12-string and acoustic guitars. There was a lot of folk in Zeppelin, believe it or not. Probably the heaviest folk band that ever existed.
Work was progressing nicely, with songs written and recorded all in the same location. Led Zeppelin III was released at the end of October 1970, and as with their 2 previous albums, the critics panned it. They charged that the record's largely acoustic format was an attempt to piggyback on the success of the popular new group Crosby, Stills and Nash.
I think they were hurt by the thing. I mean, they're selling more records than anyone else. They were sending out more shows than anyone else. They were earning more than anyone else. And yet all they were doing was getting pummeled by the press for no reason at all, because what the press was saying didn't match up to the statistics.
I know that he was very sensitive about what they wrote about him, and it really upset him a lot. Because he was one of the greatest guitar players ever, and how dare they judge him, you know?
Led Zeppelin recognized what really mattered most, their fans. Though it didn't sell as well as Led Zeppelin II, their phenomenal success was showing no signs of abating, with the 3rd album topping the charts for 4 consecutive weeks. Before long, Page and Plant found themselves back in Wales at Branrar, writing new material for their 4th album. After a brief recording stint in London, the band once again headed out to Headley Grange to continue rehearsals and recording.
Trained and also inspirational fellows, waiting for a moment to walk in. That was the difference with them. Nothing was truly planned, but they were holding in their minds and hearts and down their spines, especially Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, a lot of knowledge. Percy Plant obviously had this gift, and Bonzo was, in actual fact, at the time, no one had played Das. So you put those 4 fellows together and you never knew quite what was going to happen. You knew it was going to be good. And so astounding, you felt like some weird cipher who wasn't ready to catch something that had never happened before. And how do I catch this and not let them down? How do I deal with this? It was so big, terrific and wonderful.
Soon they were working in earnest on an evocative power ballad, a song that would unquestionably become their anthem, and in the process, become one of the most played songs on rock radio, Stairway to Heaven.
Until the whole band comes in on the 6th verse, it's a folk song in A minor, and it's a lovely chord sequence, and there's a little mellotron in the back and a flute, and until Bonzo comes in, it could be Peter, Paul and Mary on steroids.
Well, it was recorded on location at Headley. No, Andy Johns was doing the engineering.
Now, a lot of people with a song like that would take 2 or 3 days. It took them 2 hours. And it was done. And you knew, because you had worked with them before, this is a basis for something really quite special.
And if you think about it, Stairway to Heaven, the amount of instruments, there's the drums, there's the bass, there's the acoustic guitar, there is the Gibson guitar, there are the 2 direct 12 strings, after that Percy's voice, and recorders at the beginning and the end, and that's it, pal.
I knew it was good, and I didn't know it was going to be, you know, almost like an anthem, but I knew it was the gem of the album, sure.
Peter called and said, JJ, he said, I want you to hear something that we've just finished. So he sent Richard Cole to come get me at the station and took me directly to the studios. They wanted to hear what I felt about this, you know. And they put it on, and I just said to him, gee, this is the best thing they've ever done. This is just going to be incredible.
Led Zeppelin 4 was released in November 1971 and quickly rose to number 2 on the charts. Stairway to Heaven was the album's highlight, but at 7 minutes and 55 seconds, it was much too long for the radio. Atlantic pressed for a shorter version.
Stairway was going to be a monstrous record. I mean, I think they made it quite clear to Atlantic, now, Army, don't fuck around with us this time. This is not going to be a single. And also they knew that if that people wanted to buy Stairway to Heaven, they'd have to buy the whole album.
It became an industry really with Led Zeppelin when Peter Grant turned it from a singles selling commodity to albums. And that did bring a change that they could play for 3 hours and they could also sell albums.
Led Zeppelin's notorious manager, Peter Grant, was also throwing his weight around with concert promoters. Where bands once received 50 to 60% of a show's profits, Peter asserted that the rules had changed. From now on, a whopping 90% would go to Led Zeppelin. Take it or leave it.
With Peter Grant, their pioneering way of altering the structure of the major tours in America, where it was the artist rather than the promoter who got the main source of revenue from those. Groups and artists were ripped off in every way, from record companies to promoters. In every aspect, groups were ripped off, and Peter Grant wasn't having that.
I had nothing but admiration for the man, and he never, ever forgot anyone, no matter how big or how small on the ladder, that he felt was good for the band and or for him. You know, he was with you 100%.
We owe so much to that man. He changed the balance for musicians to, you know, promoters, with record companies, etc. I mean, one man. I mean, so that is creative. His vision was amazing. His dedication was with Led Zeppelin, and between them, they had a very powerful tool.
Don't cross him now. No, don't cross him.
He could be really mean when he wanted to be, not to me, but just to other people, you know. He's such a big man and had such a big presence about him that if you ever saw him enraged, or you would be terrified of him.
The promoters had no choice but to buckle under Grant's new demands. Led Zeppelin embarked on their 8th tour of the United States, raking in more money than ever. Back in L.A., they returned to their favorite haunts, the Riot House, the Whiskey, and the Rainbow Bar and Grill.
At that point in time, there was an influx of baby groupies. And I mean babies. They were 13 and 14. And I was already the grand old age of 21. Boy, the guys wanted these baby girls. That was the next step for these guys. So Jimmy got involved with a young girl named Lori.
I first heard Led Zeppelin in 1973, and obviously it was Stairway to Heaven. I became an immediate fan and fell in love with the band from day one, and never had any aspirations of meeting Jimmy or wanting to meet them or anything like that. At that particular time, I was a teen model, and so that's how I met Jimmy, actually, because he'd seen my photograph and wanted to meet me. What happened was I guess Led Zeppelin came to town and had seen all these photos, and Jimmy had made a call to Lee Childer saying, I want to meet Lori Maddox. So next thing you know, we were taking a drive down to the Hyatt House to go meet the band, and I was terrified because, first of all, I was still, I was a baby. I mean, come on, and this was Led Zeppelin.
She was 14, or not quite 14. And he just was intrigued with it. You know, our thing had run its course in his mind, so not in mine, of course. And so one day, they were in town, we hooked up, we got together, I was at the Whiskey with him, and he left with this girl.
He just had this really wonderful, calm demeanor about him. Something very mysterious and always kind and sweet. I don't know how to explain him. when you do meet him and when you do get to know him, you just immediately fall in love with him because he's so sweet. I used to stand on the side of the stage and just be in awe and say, why me? You know, he's playing in front of 30,000 people at the Forum, and there I am standing there, and you know, he's playing. It was the most beautiful thing ever.
The beginning of 1973 saw the long-awaited release of Zeppelin's fifth album, Houses of the Holy. This would mark the first Led Zeppelin album to have an actual title. Ever since the Beatles' breakup in April of 1970, Led Zeppelin had wrestled their crown away and were deemed rock's most successful attraction. By that time, their popularity was so immense and far-reaching that a member of the Fab Four came calling to see what the fuss was all about.
George had come to the show because he called me up and he said, look, when do I arrive? And I said, what do you mean when do you arrive? You fucking arrive at the beginning. So he said, well what about, when's the intermission? I said, what intermission? He said, you don't have to know. I said, they go on at 8 and they finish at 10:30. He said, you're joking. I said, no. He said, fuck me, we used to be booked for 20 minutes and be off stage in 15.
On the tour, Led Zeppelin played to sold-out crowds at New York's Madison Square Garden. But the bigger story was the one that occurred off-stage at the nearby Drake Hotel.
Jimmy called me, wanted $600 or something to buy a new guitar, and I went to the safe and I got the 600 and locked it back up again. Gave him his money, and when we were leaving the hotel to go to Madison Square Gardens, I needed to get the money out to pay the film crew and pay off the jet or whatever bits and pieces business you want to do. So Peter said, bring all the money with you. Well, when I looked in there, the only thing in there were 4 passports. They'd known me for years and knew I didn't steal it. I mean, they weren't pissed off with me. I think they were pissed off that it was gone.
The FBI conducted an investigation, but the culprit was never found, nor was the $203,000 in cash. The band returned home and spent the remainder of the year with their families. The end of 1973 also spelled the end of Led Zeppelin's contract with Atlantic Records. Because of their immense popularity, the price for a contract renewal would be steep. Part of that price was the formation of the band's own label, Swan Song Records.
We were like the first band that they ever signed, and it just so happened that they were launching Swan Song that month. So we, as their protégés, had to go to the openings in LA and New York of Swan Song, the launch parties. First time I met Bonzo was when he gave us a lecture on behaving ourselves. Bonzo marched into our rooms and said, this is a big day for us, and you know, keep the British flag flying and behave yourself, don't drink too much. Like, all right, bless him.
On May 10th, 1974, Led Zeppelin hosted an elaborate launch party in LA for their new label.
Jesus, I mean, I'd never seen celebrities like Groucho Marx. When Groucho walked in with these 2 blondes, one on each arm, he just stopped the proceedings.
Groucho may have impressed them, but when Led Zeppelin heard that their musical hero, Elvis Presley, was playing the LA Forum, they arranged a meeting with the King.
Tom Hewlett, the concert promoter, would promote Led Zeppelin, that group, their shows, and they happened to be in LA at the time we were playing the Forum, and they wanted to meet Elvis. And Tom Hewlett, he asked Elvis, is it okay if he brought Led Zeppelin to see him? And he said, yeah, and they came up, you know, they met Elvis, they were just thrilled, could be, and they always idolized Elvis, and, you know, one of the other groups said, you know, if it wasn't for Elvis, we wouldn't have been musicians. And it was exciting for them, and Elvis was thrilled. They were nice guys.
It was a whole funny evening, you know, but I mean, everyone was kind of tiptoeing around because this was Elvis. I mean, you know, I'm sure it'd be like meeting the Queen of England or something, you know, someone you're really never going to get close to or even imagine you're going to have anything to do with.
February 24th, 1975 saw the release of Led Zeppelin's 6th album and their first on Swan Song. A double album, Physical Graffiti quickly rose to the #1 chart position. The band settled in Malibu to write songs for the next album and relax near their private playground of Los Angeles. Then, in November of 1975, Led Zeppelin entered Musicland Studios in Munich, Germany to record the Presence album in a whirlwind 18 days.
They were quick. I mean, Presence was done in like 3 weeks.
There was no time to really think the things out. I just had to lay it down more or less. First track, harmonised second track. Yeah, it's really fast working on that. All the guitar overdubs and presents were done in one night. But I didn't think I'd be able to do it in one night. I thought it would take, I'd have to do it across maybe 3 different nights to get the individual section sort of crystallised, and, you know, everything was just pouring out, you know. I was very happy with the guitar playing on that whole album, you know, as far as the maturity of playing goes.
They rehearsed it and wrote it out in Malibu, flew into Munich. I mean, Page had this wonderful idea, which I hated, that he always recorded in miserable places and cold weather. I don't know whether he did it on purpose because he knew there was nothing else to do but work, and that way they'd have to get out there quick. If they'd done it in Barbados, they'd never get anything done.
In October of 1976, an idea that Peter and the band had put in motion years earlier finally came to fruition. They had hired Joe Massett to make a movie about Led Zeppelin on the road, and the resulting The Song Remains the Same was finally released.
It all started in the Sheraton Hotel in Boston, and everybody's sitting around talking about a film which we talked about for some time. The group had talked about it, and somebody said, "Why don't we make a film, G?" So I said, "Yeah, that's an idea."
It's 1 gig at Madison Square Garden, interspersed by what we would consider to be representations of how we'd like ourselves to be seen or off stage, you know?
See, I think the main thing was to get over the fact that it just wasn't a film of a concert. I mean, there's been lots of sort of, well, not lots, but there's been quite a few films that have just been concerts on stage, and we wanted to get beyond that.
Yeah, if we're going to be self-indulgent, we might as well try and expand our indulgence a little bit, you know?
They were totally in charge. They had a picture in their mind of what they wanted to see. That was a matter of having the director shoot what was in their mind.
I mean, there are certain things that piss me off about the actual filming, but nevertheless, I mean, as far as it goes, I'm really pleased it is there. It's a documentary more than anything else.
Led Zeppelin in concert and beyond.
I think a lot of the joy went out with Zeppelin when there were a succession of tragic events which shocked everybody, really. Zeppelin were at their peak, selling albums by the truckload, and everybody wanted to see them, and their shows are huge sellouts. Zeppelin were highly respected, and then suddenly everything seemed to go pear-shaped.
On July 26, 1977, tragedy struck when news came from England that Robert Plant's 5-year-old son, Carrick, had died from a stomach infection. Robert was devastated.
And then there was the terrible news that Robert Plant's son, Carrick, had died back in England, so they had to cancel the tour and everybody had to fly back. I think a lot of the fun went out of Zeppelin, certainly as far as Robert Plant was concerned.
No one pushed him to do anything. Peter and the band sat back and said, look, you know, whenever you're ready, let us know what you want to do if you want to do something, and that was really it.
Eventually, Robert reunited with the band to record their 9th album. Released at the end of 1979, In Through the Outdoor went on to sell more than 5 million copies.
The release of our album Head Games coincided with the release of In Through the Outdoor. Somebody brought me a test pressing of it and I heard it and I thought, oh, Jesus.
Despite the success of In Through the Outdoor, discernible cracks were beginning to form within Led Zeppelin's airtight organization as well.
I've witnessed Bonzo just cut loose. He had definitely split personality. He would when he was drinking, when he wasn't drinking. He was a big teddy bear. He wasn't one of the ones who messed around a lot at all. He wanted to go home to his wife and kids.
He was such a good father, and he really loved his wife, and he really loved his kids, Zoe and Jason. I think that John's only problem was he had a classic drinking problem. His personality completely, he was a different person sober than he was drunk. And when he became drunk, he became loud and boisterous and a different person. But when he was sober, he was like gentle as a lamb.
With Bonzo, it was like going out with a sailor who had 12 hours to live, because he packed it all in. He was a lovely guy. At the end of one tour, I went up to say goodbye, knocked on his door, yeah, come in. And there he was. He was packing his suitcase. He was very fastidious, John. He had all his clothes hung and very neat and tidy. But he was wrapping these sort of Japanese dolls and little dolls that he collected from various countries and towns for Zoe, his little daughter. And he was wrapping them individually. And this is Zoe. I don't see enough of her. and they were all laid out in a row in his suitcase. I thought, wow.
People don't realize how much time they spend away from home. So he would get really drunk and then become a whole other human being, a real angry guy.
The mixed feelings would come when he had to go to work, and he didn't particularly want to go to work. He wanted to be at home with his wife and maybe having the baby or something like that.
By September, Led Zeppelin was ensconced in rehearsals for their upcoming, highly anticipated tour of America. But it was during these rehearsals that the group was dealt an unthinkable blow.
Bonzo, when he got drunk, was, whew, he didn't want to be in the raw end with him. Well, he's just gets very nasty, you know, very wild, you know. The booze, you know, the booze, I mean, that's what killed him, you know.
John Bonham was known as a man who loved his alcohol. On September 24th, 1980, Bonham was picked up from his hotel for rehearsals at Bray Studios. During the journey, Bonham consumed a steady diet of quadruple screwdrivers and continued to drink heavily at the studio. A halt was called to the rehearsals late in the evening, and the band retired to Jimmy Page's house in Windsor. After midnight, Bonham had fallen asleep and was taken to bed. He died in his sleep later that night. He was only 32.
Shocked. I mean, I was just shocked. No one knew at that moment how he died. We knew that they were rehearsing. But how could he die in a rehearsal? You know, this was the thing. We didn't realize at the time he'd drunk and they put him to bed. And, you know, the classic rock and roll death, you know, choking on his own vomit. So I thought he had a car crash with drugs, and I had no idea. I just knew something terrible. The fallout from this was going to be disastrous because there was such a tight-knit band, and if one went, that was it.
Yeah, there were 4 equal members, you know, when they were on that stage. I mean, as I say, you know, one would shine more than the other for a certain part, but I mean, together they were a unit. I mean, I think that's why they broke up, that they, you know, Bonham was an integral part, but that was what Led Zeppelin was those 4 guys.
When he died, the band evaporated, and I think those guys just knew that you couldn't put anybody else in there and do what Bonham did and make that band work.
I think everybody probably wanted Led Zeppelin to continue, and there were plenty of contenders for the job of being the drummer with Led Zeppelin. Cozy Powell, Carmine Appice, people that could have played it, they could have done the gig, but it wouldn't have been the same because John Bonham was so special and his personality was so powerful. And of course, as I mentioned before, they were a team and they were friends, and you couldn't really replace him. And I think, in retrospect, it was the best thing to do.
Part of my charisma is, you know, is reliant on the other 3, you know, and the same with everybody else. You know, we really get off on playing together. That's the whole secret of. I couldn't really go away and play with anybody else, because if I wanted to play, who else would I need for a drummer but Bonzo, you know? And the same with Jimmy and Jonesy. I don't think it wouldn't be right.
Bonzo was one of Robert's best friends from a very early age, so Robert was almost mortally wounded. He was wounded forever after. It took a big toll on Robert. And I think it took a big toll on the other 2 as well.
Led Zeppelin, what can you say? They're a huge influence. A huge influence on everybody.
It was the most amazing thing ever. You never see rock and roll like that ever again. There was nothing like it. I mean, they were the most fantastic live rock band ever.
No band has ever matched them. Bands have come along who have been fantastic, but who can do all of that?
Zeppelin will always be the #1 hard rock band. They were 4 amazing guys. They looked great, they played great. They were the first adventurous hard rock band, and by virtue of that fact, they'll always be the best.